Hello, I'm Al Fry, and in the following presentation, we're going to explore further into some history that you've probably never heard. And if you're a seeker of the truth, remember, this series will examine and clarify many of the mysteries of our planet on a wide range of subjects. A confirmation of many of the concepts presented here will be found in many lesser-known books and manuscripts. Mankind has always feared the things that were beyond its understanding. Accepted history shows only crude facts, and fully demonstrable and explainable through archaeological findings. The destroyed walls of a city, for example, can corroborate the reality of some ancient battle, or a marble statue of an old ruler proves the fact that he actually existed at some time. Yet it seems that everything that bears the slightest touch of mystery is immediately classified as legend, a product of human imagination. And there's even a modern trend to ascribe these legends to some psychological problems, which are supposed to be solved this way by primitive human minds. It's interesting to notice that nobody has still tried to discover what type of psychic disturbance is being solved in our time by denying the possibility of the so-called legends being actual descriptions of facts that happened, but they're not fully understood by the humans who observed them, and still less by modern historians. And for example, there are many things in the Old Testament that are classified as religious or mystical experiences which must, at best, be considered metaphysical or metaphorical, or as having some obscure symbolism. Greek mythology is interpreted as the invention of supernatural figures, endowed with powers ordinary humans always wish to possess, and thus becoming sublimations, archetypes, wish fulfillments, and so on and so forth. And it seems that nobody today in his sound reason would even entertain even the slightest idea that there might be something or somebody on the top of Olympus besides frequent clouds and mists. The Middle Ages are also full of things our modern history would be happy to make everybody forget, being unable to do so completely. And just because they're closely linked to many understandable and undeniable historical facts, and they keep appearing in the writings of important philosophers who cannot all be erased from the textbooks. There are many references, for example, to witchcraft during the Middle Ages, as well to as extraordinary feats supposedly performed by witches and sorcerers. For example, they were supposed to have been seen flying on brooms, which are not precisely very suitable artifacts for flying. The alchemists, to whom our modern chemistry owes so many of its first breakthroughs, are classified as charlatans when they state that they found the philosopher's stone and succeeded in making gold from lead. Most of these things are explained away as products of daydreaming and fraud and big talk in order to scare primitive, uncultured minds. And still, our modern, objective, and mystery-destroying history fails to explain several interesting facts, leaving them in the realm of questions that cultured people should not be asking just because other cultured people are unable to answer them. For example, where did all the goldware found in India, China, and other countries of the Orient come from? India and China are not among gold-producing countries. Nobody has ever found the mines where all the gold of the Maharajas and Mandarins came from. And the same could be said about the Indians before the discovery of America. Aztec, Incas, and other cultures used gold for almost everything, but nobody ever tells anything about the methods of gold mining employed by them. When the Spanish conquerors arrived, The places where there was actually gold in America was still untouched and contained all the gold Europe might wish to mine, while these mines should have been exhausted if all the gold used by the Indians had been taken out of them. Probably one of the most interesting cases of unexplained historical facts can be found in the Old Testament, with King Solomon as the protagonist. Israel could not be considered as a rich country when Solomon became its ruler. David had left it as a state of shepherds who owned very little, if anything, outside their herds, and then all of a sudden this little country became the most magnificent, rich, and powerful kingdom that's ever been known on earth, according to the records. Gold in an immense quantity was used to cover the famous temple and the palaces. The most powerful kings considered a great honor to be able to visit Solomon and see his face and listen to his wisdom, all being surprised when they saw his wealth, which was far greater than anything that they were able to imagine. The Old Testament states that silver was not considered as precious under Solomon's rule, and that he practically paved Jerusalem with silver like cobblestones. Well, how did all this wealth appear so suddenly? Where did all this gold come from? The legend says that Solomon had mines in Central Africa, but with the means of transportation used in those times, his lifetime would not be enough to bring so much gold from so far. Well, King Solomon himself was a mysterious figure in history. Legends repeated over in a low voice during the Middle Ages mentions powerful things about him, wonderful things, but they must not be spoken out loud, or the Holy Inquisitor might hear them. His ring was supposed to have a great power. Well, making its bearer more powerful than all the kings on earth put together. It was even whispered and assumed in some old manuscripts that he had some treaty with demons who worshipped and obeyed him. Despite all this power and glory, his tomb has never been found by archaeologists. And here the Old Testament makes a strange reference, which could indicate that somebody has torn some pages out of history somewhere. In one place it's mentioned that whatever Solomon did is carefully described in the book Solomon's Deeds. And where are all these books? Well, the best we can get from our historians is a shrug. Nobody's ever read them and been able to recount that he found in their pages. And did they tell us things the human mind was not prepared to understand and therefore referred to destroy? And who destroyed them? Or would some holiness suffer if these books were included in the Bibles? Well, we'll never know. Just quite who and by what right they decided to proclaim themselves judge of the one who was the greatest of all men, denying the future generations the right to know the truth about the past of mankind. Well, one thing remains clearly visible. Our knowledge about our planet is not complete. Pages and even whole volumes have been torn out of history. But is it possible to erase whole chapters of events so as not to leave the slightest hint of what actually happened? Well, mankind is composed of many different cultures, and if one has destroyed an unwanted evidence somewhere, in some other place, a different culture may have reconstructed or recorded in writing or in memory some of the more outstanding facts regarding those times and events. Well, somewhere there has to be some book mentioning what has been kept from our eyes, and such a book does exist. And it comes from the mysterious Orient, where people are not afraid to talk about things that they've witnessed, but fail to understand, limiting themselves to describe what they saw in terms in which their own minds allowed them to interpret the evidence. Well, the title of the book, of course, that we're talking about is The 1001 Nights. This book has always been considered in the Western countries as simple fairy tales. not worth really thinking about seriously. And yet what the West has seen has usually been abbreviated translations, where much of the original text has been excluded, and sometimes something quite different when one reads a full and unabridged version of this unusual book. References have been made that the full version is rather unprintable according to Western standards, and this is true in a way. The book cannot be considered as immoral. It just belongs to a different culture. It was written by a people who are not ashamed of their bodies with all their organs and functions. Of course, this can be a little shocking for a member of society where the human body is considered as something indecent, unless it's covered with clothes, which of course very often make it only still more indecent. But when the translations are made, many detailed descriptions of great interest are lost at the same time as some too spicy expressions also. There are stories that would be a little hard for Christians to read, but whoever wants to really can penetrate into the marvelous world of the 1001 Nights. And if you want to read the true, unabridged history of that period, then get the full version of it. And just what kinds of stories does this book contain? How old are they? Well, the author of this book, Scheherazade, is first mentioned in the Indian book Katha Sarit Sagara, dating from the 10th century of the Christian era. So it's logical to accept that it was written approximately at that time. Most of the stories belong to the Islamic era, but they can be adaptations from older ones. There's at least one story which is masterfully pre-Islamic. Also, there are stories, though very few, that have been added later, dealing with Tamerlane, who lived during the years 1336 to 1405 A.D., and other obviously invented things, opium dreams and such. But the immense majority of the stories are truthful narrations of historical events, be they wars, things that happened to known persons from the Islamic history, or just descriptions made by travelers of their adventures. There are also special tales to illustrate the Islamic doctrine and philosophy, as well as just plain anecdotes and the hashish dreams, which can easily be differentiated from the former ones. The book itself is of Indian origin, yet belongs to the Muslims established in India. With the only exceptions of obviously invented stories, the descriptions are very accurate, even though the narrator did not always understand what he'd seen, limiting himself to express in terms of understandable for him what was beyond his usual everyday experience. So, for instance, there were descriptions of things which Arabs, or at least the Arabs from cities, did not know, but which result in quite familiar source for a modern reader, particularly with the one who's visited different countries. And if some descriptions of what is presented as something unusual are true, then there's no reason for believing that other things in the same story have to be simple inventions. Historians that go back to this period observe that authors of these stories had actual very little imagination, if any at all. They just narrated things as they happened, without embellishing them or adding anything out of their own fantasy. It's a feature of the Eastern, and particularly Muslim, character to relate with great precision the facts they witnessed or stories they've been told, without introducing the slightest change in them. and they hold before themselves the example of the Holy Book, which has to be repeated without the slightest change. Therefore, the stories present a great precision, even though they've probably been retold for many generations. So now we're ready to open this mysterious book, a door into the past of mankind, and a door that leads us into a wonderful and unusual world. And first we must get acquainted with the people whose stories are told there, their mental setup and cultural attitudes. And it's a world of brilliant knights who never experience any fear when in danger, but may easily faint before a beautiful girl. A world of enchanting girls with innocent looks who can seduce the best man and play a dirty or even cruel joke on him. And a world of great rulers who can order their best friend's head to be chopped away just because of some word that they didn't like, or to forgive the life of a sentenced person who tells them a good story. A world of wild adventure and of people who are willing to risk their lives just in order to contemplate beauty, and in the face of deadly danger, praise God for making flowers so beautiful. And knowing that no matter in what a desperate situation they may be in, the Almighty will save them, and that the only of these things happen that to have to happen, nothing else being possible. And this strange world, which belongs to the pages that have been torn from our history, is full of ever-present genies or jinn, who appear at the least expected moments in order to help people, with some exceptions of those who came to harm. But they are rare and explainable, and as things happen over this ancient world, as a great protecting shadow, these jinn protect those who need protection, and it's the invisible but constantly present ideas, concepts that are in people's hearts and minds that aid them and image the wisdom of Solomon ben David in peace and prayer with both. Now, if only one or two stories are read, they may seem fantastic enough to consider them as products of imagination. But when you continue reading, the descriptions of the jinn begin to follow a certain pattern. More hints at their origin can be found in each new story that you run across. And the reader will begin to recognize strangely familiar things. That is, familiar to our present civilization, but completely unknown in the described times of that era. At least after reading over half the book, one begins to see a sort of connection between the descriptions found in different stories, falling together as parts of a puzzle to a present and a whole picture. One begins to recognize strangely familiar things. Things that you catch over and over throughout the books. And after finishing this great book, all things have occupied their precise places in the great whole context, showing us very clearly that part of our past, which has been denied us by history, by filling the gaps and interplacing with the so-called legends of other civilizations and offering a complete new idea of a long period in this past of mankind of ours, being able to project some light on things that are happening in our present time. And one thing should stand out quite clearly from the beginning. Jinn are not ghosts or spiritual beings, as modern interpretations of Oriental mythology would like to make us believe. The people in the stories are physically similar to us, but on a different level of cultural and technological development. And also it's obvious that the narrators sometimes mistook machines for living beings. many strange beasts and such are described. Now, a machine controlled by an intelligent being appears to be acting in an intelligent way, and for an observer who has never been seeing any machines before, that would be far more complicated than the simplest application of levers, such as a machine. It would appear as a living creature, and it would appear to be an intelligent one. Later, we'll try to point out and explain in detail who the Jinn were and the achievements of their technology and knowledge, as well as indicate the exactitude of the descriptions in the 1001 Nights, where things are related that can be known only to people who have experienced them, and which would be impossible to imagine correctly for somebody belonging to a non-technological culture, as that of the ancient Arabs. At this point, though, we want to return to the missing pages in our history to fill in these gaps, to offer replies for the unanswerable questions, and finally allow the reader to see the complete aspect of the whole jigsaw puzzle, mankind's past here for the viewer. And our story begins far away in time and space, probably on some faraway planets, if you read the first 2 chapters of Genesis, because it's not difficult to find such contradictions between the first and second chapters, that it's difficult to understand how such a great thinker such as Moses could write about such contradictory things and illogical things unless they're not contradictory and illogical. Now, it's very probable that many pages have disappeared from between these chapters, and it's not our purpose here to discuss the Old Testament, establishing who is who or whatever. We're referring here to things that show that in the 1001 Nights there are corroborations with other writing. Now, reading the Genesis as it is written, it's obvious that the people created by God in the beginning were not Adam and Eve, as well as that these later ones were not created by God. Well, sometime after God created people according to his own image, creating men and women, blessing them and ordering them to grow and multiply, an ingenious scientist evidently named Yahweh or Jehovah, possibly slightly envious of the fact that God had the power to create everything, began some weird experiments on a life on this planet, of which we could not assure whether it was Earth or not. And this Yahweh knew that he was unable to create in the proper sense of the word, making things be just by ordering them to be, but he had hands with which he could fabricate many things. And he made man of clay, naming him Adam and blowing life into him by some scientific process insufficiently described to be worth discussing. Well, once this god or jinn saw that Adam really lived, he was filled with joy and pride, of course, and afterwards he called all of his friends to show them his achievement. He requested that they admire Adam and bow before him. According to the tradition, everyone did except one, Yahweh's best friend, a proud and wise man called Iblis, a great warrior and commander of a powerful army, and also a man filled with love for fine art, music, and singing. And he refused to bow before Adam. And I can even imagine that he probably made some unfavorable remark about his surrogate man, saying that nothing good could be expected from a thing made of dirty clay. Well, we can just imagine that that was the end of a fine friendship, since Yahweh probably told Adam to stay away from Iblis and his people. Still later, after many years, in the times of the 1001 Nights, Arabs used the expression, "May God confound Iblis." And here you see a couple of deity figures from these early cultures in the Mideast. Well, Yahweh's problems with Adam began almost immediately, of course. First, he had to make a garden with plants to provide food for his invention and give him adequate company, making all kinds of animals for whom Adam invented arbitrary names, and finally realizing that animal could replace human company, even for artificially manufactured man. And so he at last remembered that God created not only man but also woman, and nobody knows whether by this time he'd run out of clay, or his clay reviving device had suffered some mechanical defect, or maybe it had been spoiled by Iblis in order to put an end to such anti-natural experiments. Well, the fact remains that Yahweh was no longer in conditions to make woman of clay, and having to resort to living tissue for this, so he performed some surgery on Adam under anesthesia, described in Genesis as making sleep fall on Adam so that he fell asleep, and finally succeeding in producing a woman, whom he did not even bother to give a name. Well, almost everyone knows what happens in Eden, and the various legends of humanity in the prehistory eras, how Adam and his woman were exiled to Earth. It was probably the first planet-wide concentration camp in human history, and only after arriving on Earth did Adam decide to give the woman a name, calling her Eve. And it's easy to imagine how Iblis chuckled looking at Yahweh's troubles with his pets. It's interesting also that I found no evidence could identify Iblis with a Christian's concept of Satan, who is a mysterious being if one tries to search for him in the Bible, and needs some words of rehabilitation. But this I might do on some other occasion, and in the contrary, Iblis is differentiated from Shaitan, who is the Islamic version of Satan. So they are obviously different persons. And since this time, of course, two different races, though similar in appearance, inhabit our planet. The Old Testament makes this distinction by calling them children of God, indicating that they are those who are literally, directly created by God, and the children of men, as descendants of this artificially produced Adam. Now this can be checked in Genesis, where sons of God are mentioned to interbreed with the daughters of men, and they gave heroes as offspring. This fact also appears in Greek mythology, the heroes being the children of Olympic gods and Terran women. Now the Arabs simply called these hybrid races the Jinn, who obviously inhabit an infinity of planets in the universe, and the Adamites, or Ibn, or Adam, who inhabit the earth. As an example of this, an Arab prince says to a Jinn princess, "How can it be that you, a princess of the Jinn, have fallen in love with me, an Adamite, an inferior being?" And the Jinn boasts, "No Adamite has ever placed a foot on this ground." And another Jinn explains to an Earthman, "I must warn you that it is impossible for a son of Adam to know by looking at her face whether a daughter of Eve is really a virgin, since this knowledge belongs only to God and His chosen ones." Now we can't venture too many thoughts as to when exactly the Jinn landed on Earth, but the Egyptian records and scriptures tell about strange sights in the sky as far back as the reign of Thutmose III, which was about the century 15 BC, Ramses II, which is 1304, 1237 BC, when he was left alone by his friends. He received help from people coming from the sky, and they told him to attack his enemies all alone, which he did, defeating them with the help of these flying people. And this is in the records. The story is inscribed on the walls and pillars of one of the temples of Ramses II. And it's quite possible and likely that some kind of surveillance has always been kept over earth in the descendants of Adam, just in case. And this has been mainly performed in such a way as not to interfere directly with the development of our planet or the choice, though some chosen ones were aided by Jinn. And the part that really interests us begins probably shortly before Solomon David's son became king of Israel. By the time this happened, several highly technological groups of jinn were firmly established on earth. And these jinn could be classified basically into two main groups: those who were idolaters and those who worshiped the single God, who were called Muslim jinn, good Muslim jinn. Now, it seems somewhat surprising to find that Arabs call Muslim people who lived obviously long before Islamic era, including Kings David and Solomon, as well as many prophets of the Old Testament and even the jinn. Yet this mystery is even easily solved. And yet in one of the stories, an Arab is asked to explain the basis of this marvelous faith, Islam, requiring that the Islam is based on the great truth revealed to Arabs by the prophet, and that there is no other God except God. So if you think about it, according to this definition, it's evident that whoever understood this great truth, independently from the time when this happened, can be considered a Muslim. And from now on, we'll use this term as we describe Muslims. Believer in the one God. Now, these differentiated from the gods and lords of the planets and those who followed them under dominion and domination. And somehow King Solomon managed to sign a treaty with the Muslim part of the jinn, validating it with his seal. And even about 20 centuries later, when people met a jinn, they asked him whether he recognized the validity of Solomon's seal. And if the jinn answered affirmatively, he was considered a friend who could be trusted. Now, if he did not recognize the seal of Solomon and the free choice system, they were politely asked to continue on their way without interfering with people. And to describe an evil jinn, it was stated that he was a jinn of bad species, one of the rebels who believed in nothing and didn't recognize the supremacy of Solomon bin Daud. And in the 1001 Nights, Solomon is referred to as master of all jinn, a thing that is also present in the medieval sayings of the West. And according to tradition, Solomon allied his forces with demons and acquired magic powers from them. Of course, a highly technological civilization is that of the jinn, using firearms and aircraft of different types and matter transmutation and anti-gravity, and having a scientific knowledge of chemistry and matter structure as we cannot even begin to imagine with our present state of development, could transform a poor shepherd kingdom in the most brilliant kingdom on earth in a very short time. Think about it. Gold and wealth, of course, would have been no problem under such a system. The most outstanding and historically important event that happened under Solomon's rule, any reference to which have mysteriously disappeared from the Old Testament, was the war. A war in which he, together with his friend Domriat, ruler of the Muslim jinn, destroyed the might of the Sea King, who was an idolater, refusing to recognize that there was only one God and to accept Solomon as the prophet of God. And this war took place somewhere between the years 973 and 933 BC, while Solomon was king of Israel. The defeated enemies escaped as they could, and many were pursued by the victorious army and destroyed during months after the end of the actual war. But some of them managed to hide where they could not be found, surviving and having a descendant. The descendants were considered as dangerous to the good Muslims. Well, unfortunately for our civilization, the kings who ruled Israel after Solomon were not considered by jinn as trustworthy, and all the wealth of the great kingdom on our planet disappeared very shortly after his death. One of the more important references to jinn in the Old Testament after Solomon is a story of how the prophet Elijah was taken alive to the sky on a fiery vehicle that rose in a whirlwind. It was obviously some rocket ship. This happened in the 9th century BC, and not long afterward the ancient Greek culture began its development. Greeks counted their years beginning with the first Olympic Games in the year 776 BC, but the actual development of their civilization started much earlier, before reaching the stage of being able to perform the Olympic Games. During this early period, Greeks worshipped anthropomorphic gods, human in shape, superhuman in powers, who lived on Olympus, the top of which was always covered with clouds. So why should we consider that these gods were a pure invention of the ancient Greeks? And why should we deny the possibility of their real existence? When Elijah went into the sky with a coach of horses of fire, it's been accepted as truth, because it's stated in the Old Testament, which is Christians have chosen to recognize. But when Zeus drove his coach across the skies, it has to be considered as a product of overexcited imagination, just because poor old Zeus happened to be worshipped as a pagan god and could not find a due place in the Bible. Well, if the Greek religion had survived and not the Christian, probably the story about Elijah would have been considered fiction, and that of Zeus as the holy truth. And some group of the defeated jinn of the Sea Kingdom and their allies could easily have sought out such a peaceful place as the top of Olympus to hide from their enemies who were searching all the air for them. Since they were idolaters, they had no objections to being worshipped themselves as gods by the Adamites who inhabited those places. And they could have lived in peace and been respected, using their technology to amuse themselves and also help from time to time the people who worshipped and obeyed them. Sound familiar? Well, the cult of Neptune, god of the sea, was probably a sad memory of their destroyed sea kingdom and its king, or maybe even some descendants of that king who were among them. Venus, born from the sea, could actually belong to the sea people. In similarity to the sons of God described in the Old Testament, they also found the daughters of men to be handsome. In this way, the great heroes of the Greek mythology were born. Many interesting things can be observed in that mythology if it's looked upon objectively, assuming that the described facts really happened. For example, the case of Icarus was probably an unfortunate result of some Adamite having seen the flying device used by the inhabitants of Olympus and wishing to make such a thing himself. Pan helped the Greeks to win a battle just by making strange noises, causing panic, fear among their enemies. This can be explained assuming that Pan had some weapon that produced at the same time as audible sounds some fear-provoking subsonic waves And these are only a few examples. The viewer can find themselves logical scientific explanations for the other stories here. The Romans accepted the Greek divinities without further questioning their origin, and it's uncertain whether they lived in such a close communication with their divine protectors as the Greeks did, but they worshipped them just as faithfully. And then came the fall of Rome, in some of the darkest times in all of recorded history, the mysterious and awe-inspiring Middle Ages. It is also a sad page in the history of Christendom, and when all progress in sciences have been opposed intentionally and eradicated because of an obscure interpretation of the Christian doctrines. And on the other hand, in Arabic countries, a new religion began to strengthen itself after the Hijra in 622 AD with the advent of the prophet who explained to Arabs the great truth that there is only one God, the same truth for which Solomon had fought so many centuries ago. After the expansion of the Islamic faith, great empires and dynasties thrived in the Middle East. And these are precisely the times that we encounter most frequently among the stories of the 1001 Nights. Jinn were present on Earth in different ways, according to their geographical locations. Where there were many Adamites, they preferred to stay out of the way. Well, in other countries having other religions, men also studied the alien sciences, becoming great warlocks, particularly among the Jews, Norbergens from South Africa and West Africa, and Persians. But since there weren't Muslims, their knowledge, though often admired, would have feared, being considered as evil sorcery and contrary to God's laws, which was particularly true about alchemy, a study that no decent Muslim would ever try. And there were also forbidden places where jinn lived freely, no Adamite could ever approach. These were usually regions and places different from Earthmen, different, very inaccessible. Such places can be considered as sort of vacation sites for jinn, where some of them lived as they liked. And many of these forbidden places had the means to reach the planets of the jinn by means completely unknown even to our present science and civilization, either by space warping or through matter transmutation. They reach different dimensions or planets by these means, evidently. And as early as during the Umayyad dynasty, between the years 661 and 750 AD, one of the Umayyad rulers ordered an expedition to the forbidden city of Arian, the former domain of the Sea King, the one who did not want to recognize Solomon's supremacy. And on their way, they found many strange things and places that were the remnants of the great kingdoms, the very memory of which had been wiped out long ago. So how many of these places are still there, buried under the sands of the African deserts, just as the legends tell us? And after the Umayyad dynasty, there came the Abbasid dynasty with the famous Harun al-Rashid, who died in the year 193 of the Hijra, or 815 AD, and many extraordinary events took place during his kingdom. And generally speaking, his and kingdoms before his acquired a great deal of scientific knowledge from these jinn. Besides the technology apparent in their direct intervention, particularly in astronomy, there were many other areas. Many researchers, for example, are dumbfounded when they run across ancient astrolabes and calculation machines such as this one. Ancient, very workable. And here's another computation device from that era. It's an astrological computer. So where did the jinn get the knowledge? And which jinn did humanity get the knowledge from? The good jinn or the bad jinn? The Dominion forces? It's a good question to ask at this point. Seems about the same time in Europe there were also jinn visiting the few brave ones who wanted to learn more than was allowed there. But this wasn't easy in the Christian world, particularly in such times as the Middle Ages. There are only two groups of alien beings that were recognized. These are the saints and the angels, or the devils. And we all know what happened to those who were considered the devils, their disciples. Those with higher abilities who did nothing unexplainable could pass for angels, but those who taught people different sciences, disturbing this way their mental peace and showing them things no human should know according to the ecclesiastical authorities, were of course devils, particularly if they had horns or happened to leave some odor of brimstone around, like the early alchemists. And only during the Middle Ages did the devil's descriptions start as a creature with horns. Horns deserve a little mention here because they happen to be a very important feature of many Terran civilizations. For example, among the Japanese of the past, there are many representations and masks with horns. Some warriors over incorporating them into their war dress. The Vikings also used helmets with horns, which is particularly remarkable since they had no cattle that could have such kinds of horns, those of sheep and goats being different. But the Vikings knew that horns meant the possession of superhuman power, and since they had no cattle to get real horns from, they made helmets with metal horns as part of their battle attire. Well, many of these early tribes, like the Vikings, are trying to acquire the strength and might of people whom they'd seen with horns. Not precisely cattle, mastering such powers themselves. It has been said in Christian legends, devils then begin to have horns. It's an interesting fact of history that during the kingdom of Harun al-Rashid, and even later, Jews were said to swear by the holy horns of Moses, or even by Moses' luminous horns. And this is of particular interest because of the fact that much later, during the Renaissance of Italy, the famous sculptor Michelangelo made a statue of Moses with horns. Long after Harun al-Rashid, the hordes of Mongols also used horns as battle headdress. Does this fact refer to the symbolic strength of the cattle that was the basis of their economy, or was it due to some other unexplainable reasons? Probably nobody will ever answer this question adequately, and the scholars of today simply aren't interested. Well, there were many jinn that had horns, and what horns! But this is neither the right place nor the opportunity to go into the true meanings. We only touch on them here because they could be the true origin of the present of horns, and so widely separated in different cultures and civilizations throughout our planet. Because all of them have a similar meaning, obviously. All of them pointed to similar meaning of giving the man who wears them a superior power to that of the people around them. wearing an aura of extra energy, beings who have a higher brain wattage output. Even today, we have obscure Easterners hooked up on EKG machines that have many times the normal wattage of the average human, and they can perform what we could call miracles. And while in the Orient, people lived peacefully with Jinn, being even occasionally allowed to use their technology and benefit from their sciences. And the 1001 Nights are full of such incidents. And in medieval Europe, a common example were the alchemists. They were secretly trying to apply the bits of knowledge they managed to learn from their visitors, whose visit, of course, had necessarily to be very brief. We can imagine the results of some of these encounters. Some priest hears a roar in the skies and, lifting his astonished eyes, sees strange objects, like a long straight stick rising on a tail of fire, and crossing himself, mumbling some exorcisms, he thought, "Oh, it's a witch flying on a broom. So let's burn these witches." And there are even legends saying that the devil rode on a broom to the moon. And those who could manage it sometimes made long and dangerous voyages to the Orient to learn the great sciences that were said to be known there. It could have been whispered in secret meetings that some particularly advanced alchemists managed to transform lead into gold. And we might add in this regard that Russia learned to make gold from lead back in the 60s. A special process. It was just too expensive to make it less than they could mine it. Technology can do it today. Why not back then? Well, it was whispered in secret meetings. It probably was true. The strange odors usually present in the alchemist laboratories confirmed the suspicions of the church that their science came from the devil. And in the meantime, the powerful dynasty of the Tulunides began to rule Egypt between the years 868 and 905 AD under the rule of Tulun, or rather Thylun, as he was known among the Arabs. And two brave men undertook a journey to the forbidden city of Shidad Benad, a ram of the pillars looking for the most precious thing that existed among the people of the Jinn. Well, after their return with obvious success, one of them died and the other one was thrown into the darkest dungeon by the cruel and ruthless Thylun because of refusing to tell him the secret of what he had brought and how to use what he had brought back. Well, then, somewhat after 1877 A.D., the kind and merciful Mohammed ben Thylun, Thylun's son, heard casually about this event and freed the man from the dungeon. In sign of his gratitude, he revealed the secret to Ben Thylun, or Ibn Tulun, as he was called now. And as a result, the famous Ibn Tulun, or Ben Tulun Mosque, was built in Cairo, probably not less expensive than the famous Solomon's Temple, and paid in the same way as Solomon would have paid his expenses. We may add that the Ibn Tulun Mosque is still considered as one of the greatest masterpieces of old Cairo, and it's much admired by modern tourists, none of which even suspect its true history. It was probably made from alchemically made gold. Where else would the money have come from? Millions. So now this brings us up to the times of the 1001 Nights, in the century 10 A.D., the time of Scheherazade, the most cultured woman of her time, and possibly any time. A little is said about the time she was telling these stories, but among the few facts that refer to the period, there's an account of how King Sherar and his brother Shazazam met a Jinn, So quite obviously, jinn were still present. So after King Gerar ordered all these stories to be written without omitting the slightest detail, it occupied 30 volumes written on golden letters and becoming known as the 1001 Nights. And the king then had a great many copies of this prodigious series made. He sent them all over the parts of his empire for the amazement of future generations, in all the major libraries and temples, shrines, and mosques. This is one of Islam's most splendid shrines in the whole of Syria. Al-Maid Mosque in Damascus. But there seem to be no more written records speaking about jinn in such detail after this great 1001 Nights compilation of maybe 3,000 years was made. This didn't mean the jinn were not still around, however. And in the West, the apparitions of strange people still continued, and we usually associated with religious traditions of the particular epochs in question. And in the writings of different saints, there are references to other saints visiting them to renew their faith and strength, or to devils coming in order to tempt them in different ways. Can all these visions be explained away as simple hallucinations? Well, hardly. Because there's still no good scientific explanation to how hallucinations happen and what they are. When then the appearing strangers were women and fully dressed, they were automatically considered as virgins, with the result that the Christian world is practically full of virgins, none of which resembles any other. The ancient Greeks, of course, would consider them all as different goddesses. But according to Christian doctrine, only the virgin has the right to appear to people. And if some of these women or apparitions that looked like women were dressed or undressed appeared before some praying and fasting saint, they were immediately classified as tempting devils, of course. Even though their intentions may have been good toward the poor saint, and far more honorable maybe than the saint's own thoughts at their sight, they still, nevertheless, were often burned at the stake if they were caught. And strange things continue to be seen in our skies right up to our own days, when hundreds of thousands of people see some identified flying objects within our atmosphere. We no longer call them birds or flying carpets, of course. Today, virtually everyone knows that a silvery needle rising on a tail of fire is not a devil riding on a broom to the moon. And witch burning today is also considered as an outdated practice. We have other means today. In this enlightened society, our tendency is not to burn whoever sees something the scientists and the scientific authorities fail to explain. We just send them to an asylum. And if anyone sees an unusual person and tells it first to some priest, sometimes surrounded with religious respect, because he's having seen a saint. And if he has the misfortune to tell it first to a scientist, he's sent to an asylum and given shock therapy until he either forgets what he saw or he becomes too afraid to confess what he still remembers. Yes, indeed. As you can see, ours is an era of enlightenment and scientific progress. We're much more refined than previous cultures. Well, perhaps this is just what the authorities would have us believe. Perhaps things are just as corrupt and dangerous and barbarous and full of dominion systems as it ever was throughout all of history. Well, what we've gone through so far is briefly a complete history of mankind, with the gaps left by official historians filled by means of the light thrown into these dark places by the Oriental tales. And is there some likeliness of a line of uniformity interlacing the histories of all ages in a consequent and logical way? And are there any difference between today's UFOs and the giant birds and magic carpets of yesterday? Or are they just called something different in ancient times? And what are they here for? To teach us what our science is still unable to find out, even to dream about? And why do they come? And why don't they contact us? Are they afraid of being burned at the stake? Well, today we have different weapons. Are they coming to warn us about the dangers of playing around with things beyond our control? Or perhaps to monitor us for our carelessness? And as an Arab of the times of Harun al-Rashid would say, only God is the wisest and can differentiate between what is real and what is not real. Read the 1001 Nights if you're interested in some interesting history. Things like this. A girl here opening, the wall clove asunder and the damsel appeared, clad as before and holding the rod. Right out of the 1001 Nights. And in the meantime, it would be useful for modern mankind to become more familiarized with many of the old stories about Jan. Might learn that visitors from elsewhere are not to be feared necessarily because they're different. They're often friendly when not received in a hostile way. They could be of great help to those whom they consider as friends. And so ends Ladonke's observation on the 1001 Nights. And at this point, let's examine some related ideas that you'll probably never get from any history books you pick up. In the distant and dim past of the Mideast, there were some of the most advanced and stable governing systems in all of history. There were several dynasties that lasted longer than the British Empire and the U.S. of America to date. And the Sumerians and Semites of Mesopotamia, Assyria, and Babylonia, they all borrowed the best of their laws and cultures from earlier cultures. These had been destroyed in the cataclysmic earth upheavals. And the famed Atlantis, of course, was the primary example of this. And the earlier gods of Sumeria eventually lost their immortality, as did those of later Egypt. Researchers of our time consider the numerous writings and records on this immortality issue as another groundless myth. Well, such truths are seldom recognized by materialistic skeptics. And persons who tap the so-called Akashic records tell us that the ancient records are usually correct. And a number of the early gods did rejuvenate themselves periodically. And according to these very unorthodox views, a representative of the Creator eventually came and took the powers of these early gods and moguls away because they misused their power. And this tale is covered to some extent in another incredible inquiry series called The Earth Report. And here we see some of the retinue of the servants that were butchered and sent in the tombs with the dead kings to attend them in the next world, which was a later unfortunate event that came up after the kings lost their power of rejuvenation. A barbarous practice, a custom And kingdoms like Ur rivaled Egypt's later and earlier kingdoms. And the gods had complete control. Here we see a lady in the court of the great days of Ur. And Christians may find it interesting that this messenger we spoke of, or representative of the Creator, was called the Windy One, which is translated Holy Ghost. Leaders on the planet at that time called him thus, and Solomon was one of his descendants. It's best that we leave this subject to another presentation, however, and go on into the Mideast, because the Arab language, for instance, has changed little in the last several thousand years due to the high esteem Muslims have for the original language of the Quran. The northern dialects are similar to the Aramaic, which was widely used in the Middle East at the time of Christ. Arabic poetry has always been found and famed, but it simply cannot be translated to retain much of the flavor and beauty that's in the original tongue. Well, 1001 Nights is full of the works of two outstanding poets who wrote during the Abbasid age of some 750 years A.D. And civilizations since then have crumbled. These works have remained, and they're still beautiful in their original tongue. And the culture in the Mideast, these areas, was filled with advanced works on medicine, astronomy, and mathematics and alchemy. Back then, Europe borrowed heavily from this knowledge to overcome her own medieval ignorance. And here's a Cairo University, which has changed little over the years. Later, of course, the Mongol invasions and Turks dried up the literary flow from the Mideast, and it never really recovered again. The advanced Arabian cultures came from the survivors of Atlantis during this occupation of Lower Egypt. Euclid's geometry books, for example, were originally Aramic. Many of the great Muslim palaces are mathematical works of art. And Christians are seldom aware that Abraham sent Hagar and Ishmael out into the wilderness in Genesis. And the Prophet Muhammad instructions on visiting Mecca are closely tied in with these biblical events. And the pillars of faith of a Muslim center around prayer and being charitable, fasting occasionally, and hopefully visiting Mecca as a pilgrim. Here we see some of the visitors near Mecca, thousands yearly. And here we see pilgrims on the Mount of Mercy. It was here that their traditions tell that Adam rejoined Eve after the fall. Many of these rituals and traditions are tied right into Christianity. Well, due to the periodic floods or cataclysms that occur, the surface area and temperate zones of the Earth have changed many times. And in the Mideast area, the deserts of today were once the fertile areas of great advanced settlements, according to the traditions. And H.P. Lovecraft had access to ancient records or knowledge and filled his strange tales with mention of many of the larger antediluvian cities. Aram, the city of 1,000 pillars, was typical. It was long buried beneath the Gobi deserts, along with the legendary Shambhala. And according to Oriental legends, there were a number of impressive cities that correspond to those mentioned in the Arabian Nights. And some feel these were colonies of Mu or Atlantean empires of ancient times. And in Jeddah, a Mecca seaport, there's still a little-known museum there that contains hundreds of artifacts from these pre-Islamic periods. Researchers, Muslims of that area, and all outsiders are forbidden access to these ancient artifacts. The same secrecy exists, usually with private collections of records and writings scattered much over the East and Asia, private families, little-known monasteries and temples. They don't want outsiders meddling. And the so-called Holy Grail was a very ancient manuscript that could supposedly reveal the secrets of the gods and the ancients and bring the bearer power. Many felt it was still held in some private collection in the Mideast. Well, according to the most ancient tablets and later Egyptian papyruses, the Homo sapiens species is unique among all other animal forms. We humans not only have a soul and a body like animals, we have a very special force that allows us to evolve towards godhood. Our human minds feed good and unethical or evil thoughts both to our brain. And instead of acting on instinct, we must act in choice. It's conscience that's the mouthpiece of the soul. No matter how long it takes, the materialistic lusts must give way to more spiritual and ethical soul-balanced actions. Alfred B. Glazier, who wrote his Modern Human Comprehension text in the mid-70s, said the same thing and detailed exactly how the special minds came into being and could be balanced to perform so-called miracles like some of the spiritual leaders could perform. Glazier, like many others before him, claimed to recall former lives on the planet thousands of years ago and told of many of the ancient records, why they existed. He said that many persons who had not balanced their various components by the turn of this century would eventually lose some of these components and go back and return to an animal instinct level, going back to the pre-Adamic state, so to speak. James Churchward was a very unique writer that had other things to say about the ancient world, and he was from the 20s. He did his whole series of books on the ancient motherland of mankind. And his book, The Lost Continent of Mu, and other titles were very popular and have been read probably more than any other works in this area of interest. Churchward spent time in India and chanced upon what he called the Naakal tablets there. And these were symbolic records which were written in the ancient motherland. They eventually wound up in India. And here we see some examples, the hieroglyphics, the symbols. And the second group of tablets, later discovered in Mexico, also were written in the ancient alphabet of Mu. And some of the tablets gave an account of creation, another detailed history of the earliest man. They told of an ancient and very advanced culture on a continent somewhere north of the Hawaiian Islands, Lemuria or Atlantis. And according to the records, some 12,000 years ago or so, this civilization submerged and the remnants found their way to other areas where they had a hand in making The ancient civilizations like Chaldea and Babylonia, Ur, and Egypt, the great civilizations that they were in the beginning of our history. The language of the motherland was Naga Maya, and virtually all of the major world languages are filled with these Maya words. About half of the Japanese language is Kara Maya. India has Maya in it, and Mexican Indians can speak quite well with Japanese because their languages are so similar. Egyptian, Chaldean, and dozens of later languages were riddled with words and symbols from the motherland. Most words which had a C sound like a K were originally from the original language. Well, family names, names of simple actions and instruments are often similar in languages spread all over the planet. Showing, of course, there had to be an original source language. Well, in Latin America, the Maya spoke for the past hundreds of years has been corrupted by Aztec and Nahuatl, yet the words for Ma have survived as mother in most languages. According to the ancient tablets, the world was created in 7 periods of time, and our species was given an imperishable spirit after the fashion of our Creator. Later versions in various later cultures distorted many of these original concepts. The Hebrew historical records, like the Bible, are examples of this. Many of the early books of the Old Testament were actually written by Moses from Egyptian temple records in many cases. And they were originally in Egyptian hieroglyphics. And when these were translated, the experts of the time made the same mistake as they do today. They often translate literal meanings from symbols which only represented something. Well, Churchward and many open-minded researchers found that most of the serious creation records of all later cultures were filled with errors and nonsense. And 800 years after Moses died, Ezra and others literally butchered the original concepts of the great leaders and gods in the motherland. Well, while Churchward's book sold to the public for many years, his concepts were never really accepted by the state-funded experts. They often ignored his brilliant translation keys from these ancient motherland documents. And only private organizations like the Rosicrucian Order in San Jose, California, ever took the time to check out his research and confirm it by their own comparisons. Well, surprisingly enough, according to the translations, the motherland, the original founders of the great cultures and cities of Latin America, were white-skinned, blue-eyed gods with beards. They brought great technology and knowledge to the original Indians of the area, Latin America. And these gods did not rely on the usual ground vehicles, but used aerial vehicles. And here's a design from around 8,000-year-old Sanskrit translations. They're in India yet. Well, today's experts like to scoff at such concepts. And they tell us they'd not even invented the wheel yet. Yet this is ridiculous, since children's toys of all of these great cultures often had wheels on them. Are we supposed to think that they couldn't even adapt them to larger vehicles? Hardly. Well, the early temple drawings and frescoes had pictures of these aircraft and wheelless vehicles in many of them, but the church and state authorities quickly obliterated such evidence every time a new temple was located. And Stacy Judd, historian and writer of the 20s, had many pictures of this high technology in his original Atlantis Mother of Empires book. Yet all the public copies were bought up and destroyed in the 1930s. And only the censored second edition is still available today by this remarkable explorer and American historian. And the few copies of the first edition are in private vaults. And the people are not about ready to make them public even yet. Well, before the 3 world cataclysms in the past, a number of Indian traditions in Latin America tell us that there was once a great sea in the middle of South America. And after the first disaster, known as the Great Fire, the great mountains on the west coast arose and took many great cities of the ancient world skyward. And Tiwanaku is an example that still exists and puzzles the later Spaniards and today's scientists. They were told that ancient white gods had built the city before the mountains were so high. And in 1972, an Amazon Indian named Nara told anthropologists amazing details of all this in chronicles that his tribe had kept for thousands of years. The Akakor document paralleled the concepts of James Churchward and told of the early cities and their god rulers. The Mexican Codex Trajano tells of beams of light coming from a celestial sphere, a sphere used by the gods. And to call such advanced craft flying saucers is ironically a term which would be suitable for our present mental levels. The land vehicles in use to move heavy equipment in those days by the gods' subjects were wheelless cargo vehicles. They had no wheels. They didn't need wheels. And all over the ancient empire areas of Latin and South America, there was very well-made roads that are still in existence. And they show no evidence of tire wear from the usual wheels. And this is a view of the many remarkable terraces that allowed agriculture in this hilly area, Latin America. Few tourists ever see this. It's interesting that a few delicate art objects, like cocks of inlaid gold and precious stones, are also found in the Zebwati ruins in Africa, perhaps like the cock found in the Great Pyramid by the Caliph, which of course leads us off into the Arabian Nights fantasy again. Well, the Mayas considered themselves descendants of the gods of the East. And these divine leaders came from an area, and their land sank in the sea, according to their records. And they built these huge cities with water and waste systems, just as they are today. And they flourished until their leaders left, and later Spanish barbarians came for what was left of their civilizations, the remnants of their past glorious cities and monolithic systems, interconnected cities all over Latin America. Several private researchers claim to have talked with the descendants of the Mayas who still have some of the more ancient records missed by the destructive Spaniards. thousands of descendants still live in Yucatan and Guatemala. And here's another descendant of the Mayas viewing the temples and palaces of the ancient ruins of Tiahuanaco through one of its several portals. As we pointed out, this city was in existence before the mountains in this area rose, according to most of the traditions. And this other portal, called the Gate of the Sun, is around 12,000 feet above sea level in an area south of Lake Titicaca in Bolivia. We all know, of course, that there are huge monolithic buildings and stone walls all across Latin America. Today's technologies could not even duplicate many of them. Not even a playing card will fit between these stones that you see here. And these examples are in Peru. And some of these are 20 feet high, and the blocks weigh tons. There are other great monolithic ruins and strange formations that most researchers never even find. An example is this intricate launching platform for strange aircrafts of some past in Bolivia, and it's several acres of apertures and slots and tracks and tubes at a site which has a vortex energy point coming into it. It was these vortex areas that some aircraft used to gain free energy boosts to other grid points on the planet and off the planet. And scientists have absurd theories on this site, like being several acres of sacrificial areas for human sacrifice rites. Nonsense. Any adolescent can see the remnants of great civilizations when they stumble across them. And other evidence of very high cultures of antiquity include the stone pavements, with dressed and quarried rocks below the levels where mastodon bones are found, and stone pavements deep under the ice in the Antarctica. We could go on for hours on other strange ruins, monolithic ruins from cultures long past the motherland, their various colonies. Now, there are researchers that feel the legendary land of Ophir was in Zimbabwe, Africa, in the middle 1860s. An explorer discovered the ruins of this city and its advanced culture, just as in the colossal Machu Picchu ruins of South America that we see here. There are unusual oval towers, which were held to be the chambers of flying men. Why? Well, these towers only had openings at the top. Both cities had similar rockwork and quarried crystal carvings. Other buried antiquities, similar. Well, off the Chilean coast, of course, is Easter Island. Gigantic statues that have long puzzled researchers. And these are hardly the work of primitives who came along after the resourceful ancients. And here's a little more sophisticated statue of the Maya cultures. Archaeologists ignore Churchward's symbolic keys to reading the designs and often make up theories on the meanings of all this symbolism. The Amazons of legend are another myth culture the scholars usually dismiss, and yet the traditions continue. And Spanish explorers encountered women warriors and named the Amazon River after them. As late as 1958, explorers around the headwater of the Orinoco River were told by natives that there were fierce tribes, women warriors. They were still flourishing in the more remote regions of the area. Well, the Greeks, of course, had traditions of the Amazons of the west end of northern Africa and the eastern Asia Minor. Diodorus Siculus, the Greek historian, tells of the Amazons conquering a section of later Atlantis before she sank. European traditions are full of references to an early time when women ruled the civilized world. And there are still many religious sects that pay tribute to the Divine Mother. And what happened, according to some Akashic record readers, is that women ruled the advanced cultures of Europe at one time and long ago in the past. And Sumerian traditions told of the goddess Tiamat coming from the ocean to teach the primitive people the high arts of cultures, a great civilization. And all went well with men and women as equals for a time. And then in several areas, like Crete, the women began to take over and use men as slaves, according to the records. And in pictorial artifacts dug up at Crete, Pylos, Tyrians, and other early Greek sites, women are shown leading men in all areas of life. One stage, men were castrated at one point, and eventually, though, the outlying barbarian tribes of men gained enough strength to overcome the women, and severe laws were put into effect to see that women never regained their powers. And we can look at history and see that cruelty and general barbaric actions against women continued for centuries after these early periods. Medieval laws of church and state, for example, took virtually all of women's rights away. They destroyed all evidence they could find of the early woman-oriented societies. And even today, references many works of the female-oriented societies of old are considered myths. Dig deeply. Go to your library and you can find the truth if you dig deeply enough. So now let's turn to North America. According to the ancient tablets and records, the American continent had been occupied by 4 races and civilizations before the American Indians came on the scene. Well, fossil lake areas of inland present Oregon have obsidian arrow points in the same strata as the Mesozoic age animals. And there are thousands of vignettes and rock drawings that are found all over the West, with ancient symbols of the motherland. And some even depict burnt sacrifices to the memory of the fiery death of the motherland. And if you look at it, virtually all ancient cultures after Mu or Atlantis sank included burnt sacrifices in their rituals. Today the origins are lost, but their traditions continue. Churchward felt that the first settlements in the North American continent were in the southwest and probably as old as the Pliocene area. And after a cataclysm, a second and possibly a third civilization started up in the same area. And the later people left rock writings indicating they spoke an offshoot of the original motherland language. And we moderns find a number of artifacts. They include miles of drainage pipe in Arizona and pieces of silver wire screen and sheet plastic, thousands of years before plastic was developed, and other advanced artifacts, showing, of course, that we had very high technology here at one time. And pottery, of course, has always carried many symbols of the ancient motherland's language and symbols. And the Hopi and Zuni tribes of the Four Corners area have traditions telling of their original migration from the motherland. They even retain many of these symbols of the original motherland civilization, as we've seen on the pottery and in the symbols. And while the learned historians like to think that they came over the Bering Land Bridge, the Indians know that this is nonsense, because their traditions tell of their coming in ships from the directions of the setting sun. And the historians may call their traditions myths, yet the Indians hold that these myths are true history, and only vary slightly in their symbolic form. And like the South American Indians, they know that there were various floods and cataclysms that raised mountains and altered the face of the earth. And we have a separate presentation on world cataclysm and pole shifts that cover this subject in greater detail. This is in the Incredible Inquiry series. Might mention here that a Nebraska professor named W.R. Gilder found many artifacts in underground living quarters or caves on the American plains. These were mostly filled in with debris after the walls of water swept over the ages ago. Some of the artifacts showed Egyptian-like figures and were hardly the caves of savages. And we know, of course, that prehistoric caves all over the world hold similar artifacts. Well, because the written records of ancient times were often destroyed, there has been another long-lost and little-used way of salvaging history that was seldom accepted by scientists and historians, but it will prove interesting here, perhaps. After all, we are trying to keep an open mind in this presentation, and the Akashic record retrieval system is based on the fact that all of the past is supposedly imprinted on the vibrations of our surroundings. And persons who can tune in on these vibratory levels can get a rerun on the past. And such persons channel in the experiences of the past and are called psychics or channels if they work through other identities. And the one problem with these Akashic record readings is that not many persons are able to check out the authenticity or accuracy of the information. And quite often, the information just can't be relied on. There's simply an ignorance as to how to check out such information. And such information can be tainted with misrepresentation, or it can be false because of the identity that's feeding it to a channel deliberately distorts it for ulterior motives. Jesus Christ himself admonished us to try the spirits, and in a sense, this is what must be done in accepting this data. We must ask the source if they are of free and under the laws of choice of the one Creator, or if they are of dominion and of the reflection and under one of the gods' system, one of the gods who rules this planet. Because in the other dimension, all identities know their status, and they will respond to you, or they will leave if challenged. Data from dominion-oriented sources can simply not be relied on. Simple as that. Well, we cover this in another presentation, but we should know that there are hundreds of books and reports on the ancients and their civilizations that have come through this channeling, and psychics who are reading the vibrations or Akashic records of the past. And these should not be dismissed. They simply must be checked out, and this is very simple. Now, to show an example, we'll include Molly Rhodes, who's a modern human student who read the comprehension courses of A.B. Glazier and learned to tap in on her higher awareness levels. So let's look at what her ancient soul, or record keeper, or computer tapes, if you want to call them that, had to say about some of the ancient cultures. we've received letters like these for years, a mixture of Hebrew and English. This non-material fragment or portion of a her likes to be referred to as Resilius I. Is that what it was once titled in the past? And it likes to write in the Hebrew language because it is more accurate. To communicate with us, she has to use English. And this inner identity of Molly's states that our species started in Lemuria. It had many strange sizes and types compared to today. This species was definitely not at the lower Neanderthal or caveman level. And these various subhuman species were existing as separate outcasts, along with a more advanced man for many ages. They weren't any more part of the higher culture then than today's mental retards or monkeys are a part of our present society norm today. And as the higher alien visitors taught the later Atlanteans and others the higher refinements of civilization, there were super cities and cultures existing at the same time the primitive cultures existed. And the Mideast and Europe are filled with evidence for these higher early civilizations that were offshoots of the motherland. And as we mentioned, these super cities and cultures existed at the same time the primitive cultures existed, since the periodic floods and cataclysms destroyed such high cultures. There's scant evidence for them, but the evidence is enough to know what went on for the truth. When the Atlantean states and cities were destroyed, many survivors wound up in the Hebrew cultures and in the European area of present Germany. And it just so happens that the Jews felt that their genetic stock was superior in some ways, and they kept as much as possible from interbreeding with other races, even up to the present time. And as we've seen, there were great cultures that flourished all over the planet at the time of Atlantis and just prior to her inundation. And as later-day Atlantis had certain warped alien identities take over her technologies and systems, the dominion systems of power and money were set up to control we humans. And such systems, as we can see today, are still going strong. And it could be said that they are of Satan, who was the highest god leader of that time, according to the Hebrew records. And things haven't really changed that much. We're still playing around with the same nuclear weapons as Atlantis did just prior to her fall. And there are still jinn or aliens of some type that are evidently monitoring us. Still. They're not on flying carpets today, though. Their craft at present seem a lot more sophisticated than they once were. And at what point they will restrain our choice actions today is an interesting question. There are seemingly a half a dozen incidents that would show that these aliens have interfered to some extent to keep us from pushing the buttons and blowing ourselves and our planet to pieces. This is another subject which is too long to cover here. So going on to other subjects within our realm, let's look at the New World a little closer. And in Atlantis, the legends tell of a city on an island in a lake surrounded by canals. And in the South American civilizations, many of the characteristics of the homelands or motherland were retained. One example that we can still see is in Mexico City. Mexico City originally was a smaller duplication of Atlan on Atlantis. before the Spaniards came. It was rebuilt, and only one of the waterways is left. Gardens of Ochimilco. Many tourists still go on these, and a few of these canals still exist. Instead of Atlas of Greek legend, the Americans called their leaders of old the Bacobs and showed them with long beards, just as the Greeks did, and most other of the ancient cultures. Long flowing beards, sometimes red, a white-skinned race. And tradition tells us that these gods came from Tulapalan, or the Red and Black Land. And Plato referred to Atlantis as having red and black rock formation. Now let's turn to the ancient Atlantean Empire. And because it would take many hours to cover the dozens of references and sources for many of these historical concepts in this presentation, about the best we can do is touch lightly on these subjects. And there is other information that you can track down. Atlantis was positioned in a northern latitude. The original races of Atlantis were fair-complected and had no need of darker pigmentation as protection against the strong sunlight. And as Atlantis sank, many survivors wound up in northern Europe, and especially Germany. And even today, the scientific German language that is more technologically precise than the regular German is not too unchanged from its original use on Atlantis. And on the American continent, many so-called Indian races were survivors of Atlantis originally. And according to their legends, a thunderbird or flying craft scouted out a suitable new home for their ancient ancestors. And Atlantean religious concepts, beliefs, and traditions continued all across the North and South Americas until they were more or less obliterated by new catastrophes and floods and wars and other cultures. On this map, you see the continent of Atlantis with its northern mountains, which are now have their tops jutting out as the Azores Islands. And to the right are the present Canary Islands, and at the bottom, today's Cape Verde and Barbados. There are numerous underwater ruins discovered in this area from time to time, and this is a typical tabloid coverage. Well, as we've seen, Atlantis, and later Egypt, played such a significant role in the education of our early forefathers, we should cover this in a little more depth. Atlantis was one of the cultural centers for Earth some 20,000 years ago. And one major influx of alien colonizers approximately 13,000 years ago was the turning point of history for our species. And as certain aliens gravitated to the major cities of Atlantis, they gained control of the populace and technology of the area. And then later, as she sank, they spread out into wide areas and colonies, the survivors, as you see in the dotted lines. And later, because of the many inconsiderate actions of these newly arrived gods, there's evidently a representative that was sent to warn these gods that their continued domination of humanoid life forms had better not continue. So eventually, Satan and his followers, as they were later known as in the Hebrew records, lost their great mental power advantage over the naive men species here. And during this same general period, the new exiled gods began to breed with humanoids, and brought about alterations in the brain circuits of humans, or men. Instead of functioning on instinct alone as animals did, the newly altered hybrid man species was cursed with constant choice. And the so-called fruit of knowledge had been eaten in the simple life form, and the simple life style of the animal was gone. And in a number of very ancient records, we find these events alluded to. Some explain that nature wove her mantle of matter around the newly arrived gods, and they became ensnared in the material world. And when these gods mated with men, the early Egyptians called the new hybrid offspring gentlemen. And these midwayers, so to speak, were much more intelligent than the usual subjects of the king then, who was called King Menes, and thus his subjects were called men. That's where we got our name. Well, the great rupture in energies that took place on Earth at these times caused the first of the great polar shifts of the planet. It was these kings that held important posts in most of the early Egyptian kingdoms. Example, all scribes were gentlemen. Men could not hold these posts. It was this interbreeding by the gods that brought on these shifts, pole shifts as they're known as, and every 4,000 to 5,000 years the Earth tipped enough to allow great changes in her surface and a rejuvenation of the mineral and trace elements that were depleted. And Christians, of course, can get some description of this in the biblical account of Noah. Yet there are at least 40 other accounts of similar boat survivors peculiar to other races and nations across our globe. And some scholars believe that the Red Sea incident with the preceding plagues against Egypt was caused by a pole shift during this period. And Egyptian records indicate a change in orbit 3 times in these records of theirs. And this is a subject that is gone into in greater depth in our pole shift presentation. There's much truth to be found in the Bible. And regardless of what many preachers tell us, the first man in the biblical Genesis is not pre-Adamite. In Strong's Concordance, it tells us that both references to man in Genesis are taken from the original word Adam. Adam, the Adamite. Many scholars confirm this. And what this boils down to is that there were races present here before the white-bearded Adamic race and their super-being god rulers. Many scholars concede that there are at least 27,000 known mistranslations in our Bible. Some new concordances and versions help this situation a little, but it's still a subject too long to tackle in these presentations. It's probably enough to realize that Elohim created matter and then brought Adam from the celestial planes and put his spirit in living bodies on earth. And a second Adam later came and found the first Adam and his kinsman ruling the earth. And this first Adam had a soul, and the second a spirit. And this was according to Paul in Corinthians. Later, Cain got his wife in the wilderness of Nod. And Seth married a more spiritual Adamite. And it's obvious, of course, then, that Adam was not the first man, as many fundamentalists would like us to believe. Both Christian and Jewish doctrines can often be traced to more ancient cultures and traditions, and this subject is covered in depth in other presentations. And a typical example is the Jewish belief that Adam was born of Adamah, the great earth goddess of antiquity. Babylonia and other ancient cultures worshipped the same goddesses under different names. Chaldean and Egyptian astronomers had a very impressive knowledge of star systems, and it wasn't because of their crude telescopes of that time. And the traditions tell us that their mentors were the sons of Ilu, who came in flying machines and instructed them. And these, of course, are only a few of the lords and gods that are sprinkled throughout the later Hebrew records, and taken as a singular God concept today by Christians and followers of the Bible. Well, according to some traditions, the ancient alien gods who were banished to Earth in what the Bible called the war in heaven got dropped off on all of the major continents on our planet. Well, Africa was no exception, and we've touched on the ruined city of Zimbabwe recently. And establishment scholars still try to attribute these ruins to 14th century African tribes. Yet, there's continual evidence that they're as old as the ancient gods of Earth. And 10th century Arab writers wrote of this city as being a center for gold production. In Zimbabwe temples, there are the same types of monuments and figures as found in the most ancient ruins of Egypt, Latin America, and India. According to tradition, the first kings of Zimbabwe were white men who kept in touch with other white rulers across the ocean. Later, Benin cultures in Nigeria produced artifacts showing Caucasian people once ruled and lived in this Nigerian area. One of the most unusual official archaeological finds of recent years was by J. Manson Valentine, who was associated with the Alabama Museum of Natural History. And after many years of searching, he located the legendary caverns of Xquicucan in 1962 in Yucatan. They were filled with carvings and artifacts of an ancient race that predated the Mayas. The Mayas used the caverns for rituals, but said the original builders were a small race that were destroyed in one of the ancient floods. This mile-wide collection of grottos and passages was described by the famed occult writer G.W. Williamson as Lultum, the lost world of the ancients. When refound, Valentine discovered gigantic figures of all descriptions, dozens of stairways, corridors, and shrines. And included among the figures were the ever-present likenesses of men or gods with full beards. The same type of Caucasians depicted by the other ancient cultures around the world. Well, to finish this presentation, let's look closer to home about the great legend of the great teacher of North America and South America. And according to the traditions of virtually all Native American Indian tribes, both South and North, a great spiritual teacher visited the Americas around the time of Christ. And in Mexico, he was known as Coatzacoatl, and others in the South region knew him as various names, such as Kate Zal. And in Tula, the great empire of Latin America, he was said to be able to speak to 1,000 persons at least, with each person being able to clearly hear him. North American Indians called him in several areas Isi-Ni, Dakota, Wakia, and various other names, and this single white visitor literally changed the American continent in his brief travels up and down the coasts and inland. He virtually halted the fighting and bloodshed that was going on, and he taught all tribes to follow an ethical way of life. And he worked miracles, healed, and always taught 12 disciples to carry on his work. And he told the natives he had come across the great water where he had been crucified. The great writer and poet Longfellow had retold a Seneca legend about this leader, whom he called Hiawatha in his writings. And it was he who brought the Indians together in a confederacy of 5 nations, this Hiawatha under a constitution that he made up. And it was this Indian constitution that the early founders of our nations borrowed heavily from in making the United States Constitution. Later, even many European constitutions borrowed from this foundation. Whether or not this great teacher was Jesus the Christ, arisen and doing a later work, or simply a great Essene teacher from the Mideast, is a debatable question. The Essene sect did send out a great many teachers throughout their history. And if you're interested further in this unique story, this great teacher, further data can be found in the secret teachings of Jesus and the book He Walked the Americas, and Mormon records in Salt Lake City. Benjamin Franklin and various others have mentioned the use of the Indians' Constitution in making up our own in this country, and it's very ironic that so few persons know about our own national spiritual figure in their spiritual questing. And at this point, I invite you to contact us for more Incredible Inquiry productions. And in this History You Never Heard series, you're going to find countless truths that are not covered in today's history books. This is Al Fry, and so long until next.